You're listening to 3 Days Through the Wood, a novel by Bear Mawasaki, as read by the author. Chapter 18. No Way Back But Onward. White shutters strummed red and blue through the window as dark shadows ran between the light. A dog was howling, scratching at the door and letting them know where the trouble was, and then it was rending at the metal, wood straining and splitting before it finally cracked open. Catherine lay cold on the floor, phone clutched tightly in her hand. Beneath her, the floor was slick, but around her wrist, tied tightly, was the fleece that had been her father's. The paramedics swore later that she was smiling. There was a station wagon pulling up outside as they let her out on the stretcher. A portly, plump woman leapt from the passenger's seat before it even came to a halt, running to the ambulance and her daughter's side. The older children in the car tried to hold the younger inside, but none of them could hold themselves for long. Catherine's mother insisted she would ride in the ambulance with her, and then the rest of the family demanded the same, stating their rights as the oldest, the youngest, the closest, the most distant. All of them wanting to make amends in their own way. They rode together instead in the station wagon, following the ambulance and matching its speed all the way to the big hospital in the city. Catherine only learned all of this later. Her mind was lost in a haze of dreams, bright fluorescent lights drawing shadows over her eyes and turning the soft ceiling into open sky. She remembered asking them to turn up the heat over and over and over again, and at some point a heavy fleece was laid over her, red and black and checkered, but cleaned of her grave mistake. It still smelt of chicken and eggs, fertilizer, wheat and fields, and all the other things that were too deeply at the core of its being to ever be washed away, and there was nothing she wanted to smell more in the world. When she half woke, it was only to cry, to expel the last of the deep sorrow that had driven her here, and the concerned and distant voices of her family all soothed her back to rest. She was going to live. The first thing Catherine saw when she finally woke in full was the outline of someone familiar, a large silhouette blurred between the harsh bright lights of the hospital and her own weary eyes. Someone handed her a pair of heavy glasses, and the blur turned from a wild bear to the guardian at her bedside. Her mother's face lit with exhausted relief when she saw Catherine finally wake. She couldn't speak very well at first, her words only coming out in dry croaks. Izzy, conscientious as ever, revealed himself first by bringing her a cup of water. Laura had to fight to keep him and Jess from climbing into bed with her, while Paul watched apprehensively from the corner, stoic as ever and turning his head away so that no one would see his tears of relief. Catherine called him over specifically. He tried to clear his face first, but she wouldn't let him. Weakly, she reached over to his wrist, led him to the bed, and, with as much strength as she could muster, hugged her brother. Her voice was almost too hoarse to hear, but she apologized. First to her mother, and then to her family, and then to Paul specifically for all the things she'd said and the way she'd treated him over the past year. Then she told him that it was okay to cry openly, because someone needed to say it. Soon a nurse appeared, urging Catherine to lay back down and conserve her strength. She was still in recovery, the doctor was soon telling her, and the family was urged to give her space. Her mother didn't hide anything. Her tears, her pain, and her sorrow were all on full display, and Catherine understood the true magnitude of her mistake. Mother's arms enveloped daughter in a gesture so fierce that, for a moment, she was certain that the world could never hurt her again. Of course, that wasn't true. There were plenty of bumps in the road ahead still waiting for her. Some would be harsh, some would hurt so bad that they would scar her soul in the same way she had scarred her wrist, and others would be so bittersweet that she would learn to cherish them in their own way, but there would be no escaping them. That was a truth of life, and she was ready to face it now. Catherine later learned that she did die that night, if only briefly. It was only in the ambulance, thanks to the quick action of the paramedics, who couldn't have arrived even 1 moment later, that they were able to bring her back. 3 minutes she was gone, they said. But it could have been 3 days or 300. She had almost been gone forever, but now that she was back in the world of the living, she would work to keep it that way. The feeling in her hand was slow to return. She had always felt cold back at the farmhouse, where open winds wound their way through the cracks in the walls and floorboard to steal the warmth from under her. But now she felt a cold more insidious than any she had known before. It hurt because it was self-inflicted, and remained ever present in her arm where she had tried to bleed out her life. That feeling might never go away, the doctors warned her, or it could recover in time, but there was no way to say for certain. Catherine at first accepted that this was her punishment. After some time and reflection, however, she decided instead to see it as her reminder. When they brought her home, their mother did everything she could to drive the cold out of the house, building fires, bringing hot pans and bricks to the foot of her bed, layering blanket after blanket over her. Her younger siblings insisted that they take their afternoon naps with their sister so they could all share in the heat. Catherine loved and appreciated every moment of it all, but what she still kept closest was the fleece that had been her father's, the fleece that had saved her life. While the family rallied to raise her back to health, the next step was always coming. Catherine built up her strength slowly in the bedroom, never alone, always filled with the love of her family. She read many books in that time, sometimes reading them to her younger siblings who now joined her in those far-off worlds and times. She even got to revisit some old favorites as Jess and Izzy heard them for the first time, and Catherine lit old sparks of her childhood she hadn't even remembered were there. The distance that had grown between her and the world, her and her family, over the previous year had seemed so vast as to be uncrossable. But now it was gone. It had been mended selfishly by her own near death, and as Catherine thought on that over the days and weeks that followed, she realized it could have been mended far more easily by herself, and far sooner. Paul still ran the farm outside. He was looking more like their father every day, Catherine thought, and for the first time she didn't think that was a bad thing. Laura helped her take the covers down from her window, and now she looked forward to when he would drive by on the tractor, always waving to her as he did. While Laura and Catherine had never gotten on very well, her older sister made the effort to make sure she was eating again, and Catherine devoured the plates of chocolate pancakes and sausages and bacon and eggs, savoring every bite while remembering the breakfast she used to share in the dining room with her father. That Laura could sit at the edge of her bed with neither saying a bad word to the other was a larger step than they had ever expected to take with each other. That the few words that passed between them were almost free of insults and snide insinuations was nothing short of a miracle. When they hugged, however, and made their apologies to one another, that was just family. The biggest surprise for everyone was when Catherine, finally under her own power and with no one else's asking, came down to join her family at the table for breakfast. She ate just as much as the others and helped to clear the dishes afterward. She even took part in their talks again as everyone discussed their daily plans. Her mother did her best not to cry from pride. It was a little while longer before Catherine was ready to go to her mother. Old ghosts still roamed the halls, wind whispering between the wood, but they were a comfort now rather than an unease in her mind. Her father's shadow lived on in every dark corner of the house, but instead of the pained memory of his skeleton withering away, she saw instead the man that he was. He was a guiding presence, a force inside of herself that would always remind her what was right, and he would never be gone from her again. He would remain forever in the bones of that old house. The house was full of life and warmth again in a way Catherine had forgotten could exist. So much so that it became difficult to find a quiet moment in an out-of-the-way place. She led her mother into the old walk-in closet off the main bedroom, after spying Jess and Izzy waiting inside her own room to ask for another story. They needed to be alone for this talk. Her mother had remained the face of concern and protective fury in the hospital, but Catherine could see the damage she had done. It had only been 14 months since everything began, but it could have been 10 years. Deep worry lines carved into her mother's cheeks and brow. She had never been one for much makeup, usually being much too busy with the chores of raising 5 children, but even her usual glow had dimmed. A part of her was taken from her, the same way it had been taken from Catherine, and it could never be put back the same way. There was no fixing things, no making them the way they were before. There was only moving forward and doing the best you could with what remained. I don't know how to say this, Catherine started, in the way all difficult conversations begin. The realization had come to her while she was sleeping, somewhere in the dreams between scissors and stitches, but everyone had been so concerned about seeing her through the moment that there was never any time to plan for the future. Seeing how eager her mother was to hear what she had to say now, Catherine resolved herself. It's sort of about Dad, she said, but there's more to it, too, and I don't quite know how it all fits together yet. I've had a lot of time to think about it, though, and... Catherine, her mother whispered, enveloping her frail hands in her own. You can tell me anything, please, she sighed. I didn't want to push you, but if you're ready to talk about what happened... It's that, Catherine admitted. But there's more to it, too. It's all kind of connected. Then we'll start at the beginning. Catherine looked through the closet at all the things that had been her father's. All his clothes were still hanging on the hooks, his boots still sitting on the floor as if he might just pick them up again tomorrow, and her heart hurt at the sight. Not for herself or the man she missed, but for her mother, who had been just as heartbroken over the last year as everyone else, even if she tried her best to never show it. I miss Dad, said Catherine, and her voice broke so badly that neither of them said anything for several minutes. They didn't need to, because they both understood that absence all too well. They sat in each other's arms for a time, crying together in a way neither had ever allowed the other to see. Catherine's mother had always been strong, and the facade of that proud, unbreakable woman who always drove them to chores and schedules and schooling cracked just enough to show the injured woman beneath. Half her life had been lost 1 year ago, and another very large piece of it almost died with her daughter. I miss him too, she finally said. I miss him every day. When she blew her nose, it was like a car horn going off, and Catherine allowed herself to laugh at that. Her mother laughed as well, and maybe that was what they both needed. They talked amongst themselves for a time, sequestered away in the closet and sharing stories about their father, their husband. They spoke about the time he had nearly knocked the shed over when he backed the tractor into its supports, how he had to chase the chickens and round them up from the fields after Catherine and Paul put a good scare into them, and how he had been terrified at the prospect of a fourth child, which turned to both a fourth and fifth when the twins arrived, and how he had still never looked happier than the day he saw his family together in full for the first time. Her mother shared stories as well, about how he hadn't always wanted to be a farmer, but had started because the land was his father's and it had been passed to him right when they needed it most. He took to the plow to provide and set his own dreams aside. He had always wanted to write, she said, working on the same sort of tales he'd read as a child in the room that now belonged to Catherine, burying his nose in books of far-off places and dreaming up worlds of his own. He'd never had the time to see them realized, she said, not in full, but Catherine's mother assured her that, despite all of this, he was never unhappy with his own life. He loved the way it had turned out, regardless of what he originally wanted it to be, even when his story ended too soon. That was what Catherine had come to speak with her about. She showed her mother the manuscript and told her how she planned to finish it for him. The draft was unpolished, messy, and incomplete in many places, but there was an idea there, and she could grow it to the world of her father's dreams, polish it so that the rest of the world could see that secret jewel hidden beneath the dirt of their small farm. She saw the potential, and so it was with a great sense of purpose that both Catherine and her mother gathered up all of her father's old papers. Then, with the aid of the family, moved the small but heavy writing desk hidden in their closet to Catherine's odd little room at the end of the hall, wedging it between her towers of books. The second thing she wanted to do would be much more difficult, and she needed her family beside her to do it. It was another selfish request, she thought, after all that she had put them through, but she had to ask it regardless. She hadn't expected to be greeted with such enthusiasm. It was 10 months later that she finally finished the first draft of her father's work. Despite being an avid reader near from birth, it turned out that reading didn't really teach you as much about writing as you might think. It was a long process putting together the first book, going over typewritten and misspelled pages, deciphering her father's chicken-scratch notes, but the purpose of her work helped pull Catherine through her feelings that year. In a way, she felt she understood better now the sort of man her father had been, even if she still felt the deep and hopefully ever-present sorrow of his absence. Ever-present, at least, until the day that would meet again. Together, with the family at her side, she started to read at his grave her father's completed work. She wanted to show him first, wherever he was, but she needed her family with her to face that headstone, and so the second anniversary of his passing was also the first time his work had an audience. Catherine read it loud and clearly for them, her voice filled with a newfound confidence as she drew her family into the tale. Just outside the bounds of the graves, in the wood that bordered the gathered dead, a small fox came rustling out of the brush. Catherine noticed him only briefly, and although she couldn't say why, her spirit was uplifted at the sight. The fox frolicked and played nearby, searching through the forest for something, and listened to the story out of sight for a long while before vanishing back into the wood. Catherine understood now, and would know in her heart forever, that the things we love have a way of finding us again. Thank you for listening.